When you think of World War II, what do you see? American boys landing on the beaches of Normandy, the liberation of Paris, the meeting on the Elbe. That was later, that was 1944. But 3 years earlier, on June 22, 1941, at 4 a.m., the world in Eastern Europe was shattered. Without a declaration of war, without warning, the most powerful military machine of the time, the Wehrmacht, unleashed an attack on the Soviet Union. And the first thing to stand in their way wasn't a city of 1 million people, or a tank army, but a brick fortress on the border. Old, quiet, where music played and military academy graduates danced that Sunday morning. The German command allocated no more than 8 hours to capture this fortress. They planned to smash through it like a knife through butter, so that by lunchtime they could be marching on to Moscow. But the walls of this fortress have seen what is impossible to believe. They have seen people die, and they have seen people refuse to die. This is not just the story of a battle. It is the story of how a handful of soldiers, without food, without water, without hope of help, forced the world's most powerful army to bleed to death at the old brick walls. Brest Fortress. Walls that remember screams. To understand why this fortress became a symbol, we need to understand what it was in 1941. By then, it was over 100 years old. Built during the Tsarist era, it had long since lost its military significance. Inside were barracks, warehouses, and a hospital. Officers' families lived there. It was more of a military base than an impregnable stronghold. The Bug River, a natural border with German-occupied Poland, surrounded it to the north, south, and west. According to Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's lightning war plan, Army Group Center was supposed to use a swift attack by Guderian and Hoth's tank spearheads to break through the Soviet defenses, encircle the troops near Minsk, and advance on Moscow. Brest stood directly in the path of this avalanche. The Germans had no doubt, the infantry would overwhelm the garrison, and the artillery would reduce the fortress to dust. They were given just a few hours to accomplish this. The Soviet generals also didn't consider the fortress capable of long-term defense. The main forces of the Western Special Military District were located far from the border. On June 22, the fortress itself contained approximately 8,000 to 9,000 soldiers, along with hundreds of officers, women and children. They were awakened by thunder. It was so loud that the ground shook. June 22. 4:15 a.m. Moscow time. German artillery opened fire on the fortress. More than 200 guns fired point blank. The walls, which had seen Napoleon, crumbled like sand. Warehouses burned, barracks were destroyed, and the water supply collapsed. The artillery barrage was followed by an assault. German infantry crossed the Bug River and stormed the fortress from 3 sides. They expected an easy victory, perhaps a brief firefight and a show of arms. But something happened that no one expected. Stunned, shell-shocked, half-naked, left without communication with command and without a single order, the Soviet soldiers didn't run. They began to fight. Spontaneously, chaotically, furiously. Small groups of fighters gathered around random commanders, lieutenants, sergeants, and even the most determined Red Army soldiers. They took up defensive positions in basements, dilapidated barracks, and stables. By midday on June 22, the Germans, having suffered their first losses, realized they couldn't take the fortress on the fly. They had to change their plans. The main Wehrmacht forces moved around to the east, leaving a barrier at the fortress. Brest was left to die of hunger, thirst, and lack of ammunition. But the fortress didn't die. What textbooks will call an unparalleled defense began. But in reality, it was hell. There was almost no food. Warehouses burned in the first minutes. But the worst thing was the water. The river and canals were all around, water just steps away. But every meter was under fire from snipers and machine gunners. People made their way to the water at night, crawling, risking their lives. They returned with a canteen and carried it to the basement, to the wounded, to the children. Hundreds of women and children remained in the fortress. They hid in the cellars. The most terrifying sound of that defense was the cries of children with nothing to drink and the silent tears of their mothers. The soldiers held firm. They lacked a unified command. The fortress turned into several pockets of resistance, each fighting independently. The citadel, under the command of Major Gavrilov. The Kobrin fortification. The eastern fort. The Germans used heavy artillery against them, including the famous Karla, a 600mm mortar whose shells weighed over 2 tons. They dropped bombs from airplanes. They brought in flamethrowers to flush the defenders out of the cellars. But when the Germans approached the ruins and shouted, "Surrender! Resistance is futile. All of Russia has already surrendered," grenades and bullets flew in response. The defenders of Brest didn't know the truth. They didn't know that the front had already advanced hundreds of kilometers. That Minsk had fallen. That the Germans were pushing toward Smolensk. They lived in an information vacuum. But they believed that the country hadn't surrendered. That Moscow stood firm. That they would come for them. Their faith was stronger than hunger. Stronger than thirst. Stronger than death. They left inscriptions on the walls of the barracks. You all know the most famous one, discovered in 1950, "I am dying, but I will not surrender. Farewell, motherland." July 20th. A month of war. A month in hell without food or water. The Germans officially announced the capture of the fortress on June 30th. They held a parade through the ruins and sent victory reports to Berlin. But the shooting in the ruins continued unabated. The Germans were forced to constantly comb the ruins, losing men to single shots. Who was the last? We will never know for sure. But history has preserved the name of Major Pyotr Gavrilov. He led the defense of the eastern fort. His men held out until the end of July. On July 23, 1941, exhausted, shell-shocked, and utterly exhausted, Gavrilov crawled out of the basement to find water. Or perhaps to make a final stand. The Germans discovered him by accident. As they surrounded him, he, unable even to lift his pistol, threw a grenade at them with his last effort. And then he fell. The German officer who captured him later recounted his shock. This man had no strength to stand, but he had the strength to hate. Gavrilov survived. He endured captivity, survived the camps, was released in 1945, reinstated in the party, and even received the title Hero of the Soviet Union in 1957. But his heart remained forever there, in the ruins of Brest. The Brest Fortress became a symbol. But a symbol of what? Not just victory. And not just defeat. It is a symbol of the choice a person makes when nothing remains. When there is no order. When there is no hope. When death stares them in the face. The defenders of Brest could have surrendered. No one would have condemned them, the front had collapsed, communications had been cut off, help had not arrived. They had the right. But they did not surrender. Why? Because behind them was more than just a country on a map. They had wives, children, mothers. They had something they had sworn to protect. They had a home. The Germans, who had marched across half of Europe, said, in Paris, we fought in cafes and restaurants. In Brest, we fought in hell. And you know what's most terrifying? Most of these soldiers never knew their heroism hadn't been in vain. They died in basements, unaware that Moscow hadn't been taken, that the enemy would be stopped, that victory would be ours. They died in total darkness, in smoke, without a sip of water, with a faith that seemed completely unfounded. But it was precisely this faith, these people, these walls, that broke the back of the blitzkrieg. Because if you can't take a fortress in 8 hours, if it holds out for a week, if it holds out for a month, then the war will not be a walk in the park. This means this enemy will never surrender. History hasn't preserved the names of all the heroes for us. We know Kazhevatov, we know Fomin. But how many remain there, nameless, under the bricks, soldiers who made their choice and passed into eternity? When Soviet troops liberated Brest in 1944, they found a horrific scene. The fortress lay in ruins. But on the walls, on the charred bricks, one could still read the inscriptions left by those waiting for their own. "We will return, we did not surrender, for the motherland." The rain did not wash away these inscriptions. Time did not erase them. Today, the walls of the Brest Fortress stand silent. They have healed their wounds with concrete and plaster. Tourists walk along them, music plays, children laugh. But these walls remember everything. And as long as we remember, they live. As long as we tell the story, their death was not in vain.